Good afternoon, and thanks so much for joining us for our webinar here on Latin America 2023, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. My name is Abel Delgado. I'm the Digital Marketing Director for AMI, and I'm going to be helping moderate this particular webinar today. Before we get started, we just want to go over a couple of things here that we basically want to cover. First is the topic itself. So Good, Bad, and Ugly is a topic that has been actually a special newsletter issue for us for the past several years. And what we usually do is we have practice leaders write about their specific practice, and we also write about Latin America in general. And the idea behind that is for us to talk about what we see happening in Latin America in the coming year. It can be something that's going to be good, a positive outcome, of course, bad, which is the negative outcome, and then ugly, which is like the worst case scenario. When we're reading the tea leaves there, trying to say, okay, this is what the worst thing that could possibly happen, because we thought that would be a useful analysis to help people understand the possibilities in the coming year. And what we decided to do is take that article concept and translate it over to the webinar format so that we could explore these topics in greater depth and give the chance of our audience to interact with us and ask us their questions. Because when we send you an article, you really can't ask us questions. So in this particular case, you can. Now, that brings me to another topic, how you answer a question. When you look at your panel, your panelists or your participation panel, you're going to see an icon on there that says Q&A. So you click on the icon that says Q&A, it brings up a window. You can write your question in there, and we'll get it. You can ask a question at any point in time in the webinar. We'll try to answer as many as we can, usually towards the end of the webinar. So that's how that works. One of the main questions that we always get, which is continual, is, are the materials going to be available? And the answers to that is yes, absolutely. What we do usually is take each video, edit it, put it together with the materials, and we send that out to all the different registrants after the webinar is over. So it usually takes a couple of days. So absolutely, the materials will be ready and available for you after the webinar. So let's see. I think that covers the basic parts. The last thing you need to know is that this is a webinar series this week. So today is Good, Bad, and Ugly LATAM General. So we're going to talk about different countries and the broader issues with Latin America as a region, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Tomorrow, we're going to be talking about LATAM payments, good, bad, and ugly. Then on Wednesday, it's going to be LATAM logistics, good, bad, and ugly. And then finally on Thursday, good, bad, and ugly, but for LATAM energy. If they're at 12:30 Eastern time each of those days. And you can register for the rest of them now if you'd like to, just by going back to the registration page where you registered for this one. There's still time to do so, and you'd be able to attend those if you'd like to. So that's basically the initial information that we wanted to go over before starting the webinar. I'd like to turn the floor now over to John Price, who's going to tell you a little bit about our company itself and who we are and our background. John.
Thank you, Abel. Appreciate it, and welcome everyone. Again, as Abel pointed out, this is a sort of tongue-in-cheek title that we've used for a much more serious analysis of the region, where we've looked at the top 20 largest markets in Latin America and using different analysis, separated those that we consider excellent or good prospects from those that are weaker or even ugly prospects. But if you're a fan of the spaghetti western, the good, bad, and ugly, you'll understand the tongue-in-cheek reference. Just very quickly, we're very proud that this is our 30th year in business. We've been studying the region on behalf of both global investors and local investors, companies operating in Latin America now for 30 years. And as a result of that, we've developed not only a large and experienced team, but we've also developed a breadth of experience across so many different sectors. But as Abel has pointed out, we have practices in specific sectors, and those sectors will be featuring their analysis that will really drill down into the opportunities and risks of each sector this week in subsequent good, bad, and ugly webinars. On the next slide, I'd like to explain a little bit about what we do. Many of you tune in to our webinars, and we're very grateful for that, as well as hopefully you've read some of our thought leadership on our website. But what keeps the lights on, what is our raison d'etre, as they say, is helping companies through consulting engagements to better understand the region. And we do this through three different lenses, essentially. By studying their customers and potential customers through different market research techniques, by understanding and anticipating and analyzing their competition, both known competitors as well as future potential competitors, as well as in many sectors, the sort of informal competitors can be important. And then there's the business context, an example of which will be presented today, which is really looking at the regulatory, political, and economic environment in which your company is operating or looking to operate in Latin America. These are some of the questions or challenges that we help our clients understand and answer. And I think it's really important that although today I'm going to be addressing the region by looking at a national level, that's frankly just a very top-line view. And it's a view that is certainly not sufficient enough upon which to build a business case and make business decisions. You really have to look at other issues, regulations specific to your industry, competitive environment specific to your company and sector, and of course, the dynamic and interest and purchasing power of your customers. So with that, let's move forward. We are very fortunate over the last, like I say, 30 years to have worked for some of the largest companies operating and investing in Latin America. This is just a handful of them. And, it's really, we owe everything to these clients who've hired us over the years and who've, hopefully we've served, but also have served us by exposing us to really superb global best practices in analysis, in consulting, and helping shape the way we create our deliverables for our clients. Okay, let's move forward. Next, we'd like to, before we get into the content, we would like to ask you to join us in on our first of 4 poll questions. The first one, before I begin perhaps shaping your opinion about what's the year to come, we'd like to ask you how you foresee this year versus last year. And we've started sort of uncharacteristically, the options go from the most negative to the most positive, but we'd love to see how you foresee the year ahead. And we will, like I said, as Abel says, we are capturing this data, and we'll make sure that when we send out the report that you also are informed of the poll results. We'll have the results for you in a second, but we'll also report them to you when we send out this information to you. Okay, I won't belabor it for too long. Roughly 2/3 of you have answered. Thank you for that. So this is interesting. Pretty big mix. The largest being between 0 and 9%. If I were to spitball it, I would say we're looking at very moderate positive growth on average, but a fair bit of diversification in terms of growth prospects across the companies that are participating in this poll. So on average, slightly positive, but certainly about 25% of you in the negatives, and another 25% at no change, and about half of you in positive numbers. So thank you for that. Let's move on to what I want to address today. Before we get into comparing specific countries, I want to give a little background on some of the driving forces of our economies this year, and of also the political environments, some of which have worried many people. So first I want to talk about inflation, because that's certainly on everybody's mind, and the corresponding policy changes by different central banks around the world. So the first thing to take into account on the next slide is to appreciate the fact that what we have been living through over the last 30 years is in fact an anomaly. Some people call it the Goldilocks globalization. Certainly others with a different political mindset might refer to globalization in less rosy terms, but the fact is that we have had unusually low inflation for 30 years now. And it is not without coincidence. It's because of three driving forces. Number one, roughly 30 years ago, China and India joined the world economy and fully exposed their labor pools to the world's labor economy. And as a result, that drove down the cost of labor. And we've seen this, of course, this has caused political upheaval in several industrialized economies like the United States, like Germany, France, Italy, and others, as individuals, particularly in the manufacturing sector, saw their wages decline. We also saw that during this, about 30 years ago, Russia and its satellite countries joined the world economy, and through perestroika opened up its considerable resource economy to Western investment and also the greater sale of those products around the world. And it was particularly Western technology that helped unsheath this incredible underground resource wealth, whether it was oil and gas, whether it was minerals, but also agricultural products. And we've also become reliant upon relatively low cost inflation in our food supply and our energy supply. And then, of course, 30 years ago, US baby boomers, the largest economic demographic in terms of global impact the world has ever seen, began or reached a stage of their lives where they began to save money. They began to earn more than they needed to spend and save money. And that savings became the fuel or the capital of an enormous influx into the US capital markets that allowed the cost of capital to come down. So you've had low cost of capital, low cost of labor, and relatively low cost of resources over the last 30 years. That has kept inflation low. All right, that is about to end, and we'll see why on the next slide. Or it's already begun to end. In terms of labor, China is no longer the cheap assembly destination that it was up until recently. In fact, as of about 2014, the variable cost of labor in China began to eclipse that of its closest rivals. And back in 2009, it became more expensive than Mexico. And around 2013, 2014, the differences between variable costs of labor in China and Mexico began to grow and grow dramatically, such that any new factory looking to outsource offshore with the hopes of bringing that product back to the US or back to Europe is not likely to choose China. Now, there's, of course, political reasons and political tensions that have also dissuaded assemblers from setting up in China, but it's really been the economic imperative of higher costs has done that. Now, higher labor costs in China eventually has a ripple effect around the world in terms of raising labor costs, and we're living that today, and everybody's aware of that. On the next slide, we look at what happens when you take Russia and Kazakhstan out of certainly the oil and gas supply base, which European sanctions have quite effectively done, as well as sanctions from countries like Japan, US and Canada, although US and Canada are not really energy importers, but certainly Europe and Japan are important energy importers. And as a result, the gateways to the cheapest export markets for Russian supplies have been cut off. And now Russia has to either ship its oil and gas through very long shipping routes, thus reducing the returns of those, or they stop selling them. And as a result, because of these sanctions, which are, the West's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, what that has done is, of course, risen the price of energy, and they will have a new floor going forward as a result of this. And so this helps explain some of the higher energy costs. On the next slide. And when you look at at the baby boomers, you'll see that back in 2012, the oldest of the baby boomers began to turn 65. Now, of course, most people don't work in environments where they have to retire at 65, but generally most people aim to do that in the United States. So what we're seeing is that people who were earning money and saving that money, now when they stop earning it, they begin to draw upon that piggy bank. And so we're already at a point where more than half of the baby boomer population is now retired. And so they're going to be drawing down from those savings. And that, of course, is going to drive up the cost of capital. All right, next. So what are policymakers doing about higher inflation? Well, as you know, on the next slide, the US Fed has been raising rates. Now, these estimates, of course, probably need to be revised every week. We went from a Fed ceiling of 5 to a Fed ceiling of 5.5 to a Fed ceiling of 6. And now, after the liquidity crunch caused by the bank failures last week, we're now they're talking about a lower peak rate for the Fed. That's not really the point. The point here is that we are roughly halfway through the course adjustment of bringing down inflation. Now, the Fed still says officially that it's aiming for a new returning to inflation levels of 2%. We don't think that's possible, as the analysis I just walked you through suggests. And certainly there's a growing chorus of analysts who agree that 2% is not realistic. And to get there, you'd have to really break the economy. So I think there will be a meeting of the minds, and we will learn to settle with inflation at about 3 to 4%, and interest rates probably staying around 4 to 5%. That's looking forward into 2024. But those are certainly higher levels than we've been accustomed to. And that's where we're having to adjust and calibrate. Now, these numbers may seem very low in the Latin America context, but they are historically very high in the US context, at least over the last 30 years. And as a result, there will be more bank failures, and there also will be some pain further caused in some of the more leveraged industries that are very capital intensive. Let's move forward. How did Latin American central banks respond? Well, they responded very aggressively, at least some of them. Certainly, Brazil, the most dramatic, raised its rates, but so did Mexico with positive real rates of negative real inflation, as well as in Brazil, because they had raised their rates so high. Now, the end result of this, at the end of last year, on the next slide, you'll see what happened to our currencies. The most aggressive central banks in Brazil and Mexico ended up producing currencies that performed exceedingly well against the US dollar in a year where most of the world's currencies lost ground against the US dollar. Peru, which had a very poor year in 2021 when Castillo was elected and there was lots of capital flight, we saw some of that money come back in as investors grew a little bit more comfortable with Castillo. The Chilean peso did very poorly last year, and the Colombian peso even worse. In the case of Colombia, in spite of the fact that the Colombian peso, in Colombia, we had record energy sales. So that just shows you the impact of capital flight. And we'll get into that as I explore Colombia a little further down. All right, let's move forward. Now, what does this environment, this post-Goldilocks low inflation environment mean for the region? Well, certainly the rising cost of international capital is not good for Latin America, a region that has historically relied on foreign capital to fund its government debt as well as corporate debt. And this is where you see a real dividing line. There are countries like Peru, Chile, Mexico, which historically have done an admirable job at bringing down both their government debt levels and their foreign debt levels. But there are countries like Argentina, Brazil, that have high government debt levels. And so as a result, they're going to suffer more. High energy prices, of course, there are countries in our region that are energy exporters, and there are countries that are net energy importers. So higher energy prices will have a divided impact on our region. And the other impact, rising costs for industrial metals and rising labor costs, as well as rising food prices, generally will have a positive impact on Latin America, which is seen as a competitive environment in all those areas. So at this stage, we want to hit you with our second poll question, if we could launch that. Okay, my apologies. We've got some technical issues with the poll. So let's move forward. Okay, certainly it's been on everyone's mind recently, going back to last year, that there is a pink tide or we're turning left in Latin America, certainly based upon some of the elections such as Colombia and Chile, for example. So that, lends a question, is somehow the region turning left? Well, no disrespect to the analysts who've written this sort of thinking, but if you're fortunate to know a handful of Brazilians and Colombians and Chileans and Mexicans and Venezuelans, you'll know that no one in Brazil decides their voting based upon how Chileans voted. Nobody in Chile decides their vote based upon how Colombians voted. This notion that there's some kind of domino effect to politics is ludicrous and should have been destroyed years ago when that domino theory was first arose. The fact is that people vote on local issues. Okay, we have our so let's go to the next slide and let's look at this more specifically. Before I do that, it looks like we can launch the next poll. Is that correct, Abel? Go ahead, please, and launch the second poll. All right. What are the largest obstacles of growth to your Latin American operations in 2023? Feel free to pick one or two answers. Oh, no, looks like just a single choice. Okay, so thank you again for that. Again, a mixture of answers. The most important being our business customers have the money but are afraid to spend. So many of you, obviously, like ourselves, are selling your services or products to other businesses. And local currency devaluations. Great. Okay. Thank you. So let me address one of the greatest areas of fear, and that is this political change. I think it's important, and again, we're all tired of talking about COVID, but we are in what I call the third phase of crisis of COVID. The first one was a healthcare crisis. The second was an economic crisis. The economic crisis, the healthcare crisis, of course, was caused by a combination of the virus as well as the very particular demographic and situational character of Latin America, where we tended to have multiple generations of families living under one roof, where we had very weakly equipped ICUs and hospitals in general, and a lot of other factors that really made it difficult to be agile in the way that Latin American governments could combat COVID. So they resorted to pretty draconian quarantines. And those quarantines really had the unintended effect of not terribly impacting the economic situation of the top 20% of the population, but devastating the remaining 80% of the population, particularly 60% of working Latin Americans that work informally. In other words, there's no way for them to pivot their income to working remotely, for instance. And their incomes went from 100 to 0. And those rules were dictated by people in government who were basing those decisions with good intentions, but with limited information and what appeared to be a very sort of subjective manner. Furthermore, there was numerous cases of malfeasance by governments, whether there was corruption around the purchase of key medical products, whether it was politicians jumping the line to get vaccines ahead of others, ahead of their rightful place, going abroad to get vaccines, et cetera. These were exposing the sort of lack of integrity of leadership in the region. And as a result, you have a very angry voter base. And every single election, on the next slide, every single election since 2021, with the exception of Nicaragua and Venezuela, which I would argue are not democracies, we've seen either a change of power or a weakening of the ruling party through legislative elections. And so the one exception to that might be Mexico, although certainly key municipalities were lost, and the actual count of Congress by Morena did drop a little bit in midterm elections. But generally what you're seeing here is not necessarily a universal shift to the left, but a rejection of the status quo. And that might mean a movement to the right, that might mean a movement to the left. Certainly in the Dominican Republic and Ecuador, it meant a movement to the right. In Argentina, we anticipate a movement to the right. Even in Venezuela, although there was not an election, policy-wise, there was a move towards something more closer to a liberal market environment. And as a result, you're seeing really the more, I think, dangerous aspect of this political pivot is away from established parties towards populist parties. And populists, whether they're left or right, generally make their economic decisions and policy decisions based upon sustaining their popularity and much less upon what is logical for the economy. And that's what's dangerous, and that's what should worry people, not the fact that they're left or right. Okay, let's move forward. Now, when we poll Latin Americans, and this is a poll put together by Latino Barometro out of Chile, where they poll people across, I think, over 20 countries in Latin America, and they've been doing so for 30 years, you'll see that there has not been any dramatic change of late in how Latin Americans feel about foreign investment, for instance, or a market economy versus other options. So they may be angry, but they're not necessarily leftist. And if on the next slide, you'll see that I want to get back to how we're doing as a region. So when politically, we've embraced populism. Now let's see how we're doing economically performing. So on the next slide, right out the gate, it's important to see that the biggest biggest winners in terms of GDP growth, albeit from small sizes, are oil exporters, particularly between Venezuela, Suriname, and Guyana. These are some of the fastest growing, certainly Guyana, Suriname, some of the fastest growing economies in the world. And in Venezuela, we're also seeing a bit of a boom. Now, that money is not necessarily staying in Venezuela, but it is being spent on both hard goods and consumer goods in general. And there's a definite advantage to those countries in what are an environment of higher oil prices. And I already talked about the reasons behind those higher prices. Okay, let's move on. What about Latin America versus other parts of the world? Well, generally, on average, we're probably going to grow as a region about 1.5% this year, which is pretty moderate and is less than global levels, which are closer to 2%. But there's tremendous differences within the region. So you've got the Caribbean growing at over 4% this year. You've got Central America growing at over 2%. And you've got then the Andean, the region as a whole, Mexico and Brazil, at much lower levels. Unfortunately, those are where our biggest markets are. So we're looking at a year of pretty slow growth this year. All right, let's move forward. One of the upside surprises that I don't think has fully been priced into both our forecast and certainly the price of some of our export commodities is the upside potential of Chinese demand. After 2.5 years of repressed consumption behind some very strict quarantines, that has very quickly been upended by the re-election of Xi and the liberation of their zero COVID policy. A lot of people died in the last 3 months in China, most of which were unreported, but estimates have it anywhere from 1 to 3 million. But the economy has adjusted fairly quickly. Supply chains have adjusted quickly. And now consumption is growing again dramatically. This is going to have a positive impact on food sales out of Latin America as well as commodity sales out of Latin America. And again, I think we quite easily could see some upside adjustments to forecasts, particularly of those countries with strong ties to Chinese imports, such as Chile, Peru, Brazil, Argentina. Okay. We're going to ask you for a third poll now. We'd like to know, as you guys are navigating this challenging year and trying to figure out how to cut costs, how to find opportunities, how to rationalize your investments. We'd like to hear from you as to the kind of external assistance that you are considering in your efforts to make this as good a year as possible. So if you wouldn't mind, of course, if you're not looking for external help, no need to answer this question. But if you are, we'd love to hear from you. We'll give you a few more seconds and then we'll call to a close. Appreciate your responses. Okay, great. Clearly, there is a need to, in this more competitive environment, to find more customers as well as outsmart your competition. So that makes perfect sense. This is a tougher environment this year than it has been the last couple of years. And in such an environment, it's important to really get a handle on your competitive standing and do a better job to penetrate further your market. So thank you for sharing that. Appreciate it. Okay, let's move forward. Now, we'll get down to the actual analysis of comparing these countries. I want to, again, preface before I sort of start highlighting these countries, a couple things to keep in mind. First of all, again, this is looking at countries as a whole. none of you sell to all parts of any country. You're selling specific products, specific services. You have specific customers. You need to understand how they're behaving. So please keep that in mind. This is just a part of the kind of analysis you guys need to look at. But the other point of view I want to share with you is that we have done the analysis both from an investor's point of view as well as an exporter's point of view. Now, many of you actually act as both. Many companies that we work with in large countries in Latin America, they both manufacture locally and are concerned with investment points of view in terms of the regulatory environment, in terms of the labor environment, in terms of the fiscal environment, in terms of local logistics, in terms of currency risk, because you're generating income in local currency and often holding that. So your needs are far more complex. But then these same companies that may have factories in, say, Mexico and Brazil and Colombia may have a lighter touch of investment in mid-sized markets like a Chile or a Peru, where they have their own sales office and they're interested in some of those investment factors, but they're also exporting. In other words, the products they're selling in Peru and Chile are produced somewhere else, often in Asia or the US or Europe, and sold into those countries. And then there's a pure exporter point of view, where probably you're dealing with just a group of clients or perhaps a distributor, and you don't have any equity position in that marketplace, but you obviously want to sell as much product as you can at the optimal price in those markets. But your outlook on those markets, these export markets, is much shorter term. You can scale back your sales, you can scale back your advertising or marketing. You can also beef it up, you can move it around. You can be a lot more agile, a lot more short-term thinking. That's what we call the exporter point of view. So I'm going to present to you analysis of both the investor point of view as well as the exporter point of view. And many of you will be interested in digesting both. All right, let's begin. So from an investor's perspective, we looked at the top 20 markets in the region in terms of GDP size, and we looked at a number of factors, things like how much debt they're going to have to deal with. Obviously, countries that have higher debt levels, like a Brazil, are going to have to cut costs and are going to have to curtail some of the reforms they'd like to pursue. That can be a good thing. We look at 2-year import growth and 2-year GDP growth, in other words, this year and next year. We look to foreign direct investment levels and how we see those changing over the next few years. We also look at things like country risk premium, which is a factor of all kinds of investor risk and is generally measured in terms of what national bonds have to charge in them or give away in the market to investors versus US bonds. And then Transparency International, which is a very useful guide to understanding the sort of micro level treatment of companies and of your patents and of your products. And when we line these up, we see that there's an exemplary example in Guyana, but also very positive examples in Chile, Costa Rica, the DR, Guatemala, Panama, and Jamaica. So those are your great and good. And then the bad, but again, take it with a grain of salt, the term, Peru, Colombia, Uruguay, Mexico, Brazil, Honduras, etc. And then the ugly, El Salvador, Venezuela, Argentina. These are environments that are really difficult investment environments. Okay, let's move to the next slide. Now, does a good or bad investment score, what does that mean? Well, it doesn't necessarily mean anything this year, but over time, it matters. And I say that, I make that distinction. I want us all to remember Hugo Chavez. When Hugo Chavez came to power, the price of petroleum was $10 a barrel. I remember listening to his Presidente Electo speech in Ottawa, Canada, where he promised to open up all the key sectors of the economy because Venezuela was desperate for money. 5-6 years later, the price of petroleum was closer to $130 a barrel. And in that time, Venezuela's economy performed relatively well in spite of massive capital flight. As much as $100 billion left Venezuela, as well as enormous brain drain of many of its most talented engineers and business people. But you wouldn't know it looking at the GDP growth levels under those initial years of Chavez, because the external environment of high resource prices and low interest rates was more powerful than the damage he was creating as a politician. However, in the long term, we know what happened in Venezuela, the destruction of institutions and the destruction of investor confidence. Well, when we look at the region today, we see that in the Caribbean, there is a strong belief by investors that that region is improving. And if we look at the political elections in recent years, which have been very positive in places like Jamaica and the DR, we see generally governance that is pro-investment and is making some smart moves. At the other extreme, you have Colombia, where Petro has come in, and both his very aggressive rhetoric and his very pie-in-the-sky reform agenda has spooked the heck out of investors who have been pulling money out. And although some of them remain because the country is still growing, certainly are very bearish about how Colombia will do in the longer term. So change of politics, populist politics, creates uncertainty, and that uncertainty, although it may not impact the economy immediately, it certainly does over time as investors pull their plans for longer term projects. So let's move forward and look at an exporter's point of view. So from an exporter's point of view, it's mostly small economies like Guyana, Jamaica, Costa Rica, Panama, Ecuador, DR, Guatemala, and Peru that are doing relatively well. Again, I want to disconnect the bad politics in Peru, the questionable politics in Ecuador. There are other things going on in those markets. There are externalities that are helping those markets this year. And in terms of import growth and in terms of consumption growth, there's enough positives there that companies selling into those markets will continue to be able to do so, and we'll see growth. Less exciting are some of the big markets like Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil, and Chile, where you have threats to the import growth, either because of currencies or because of just a real slowdown in the economy. And then you have your ugly markets, Venezuela, Honduras, Trinidad, Argentina, Paraguay, which are really dictated by, again, either currency-driven slowdown of imports or a slowing marketplace and the ability of consumers to buy in dollars, or a troubling trade environment that makes it complicated to place your products in those markets. Okay. Next, I just want to point out that exporter point of view treats all countries as if they are the same size. Well, they're not the same size. And the fact is that most of you, although you have the ability to sell into 30 markets between Latin America and the Caribbean, you focus on the biggest ones. And because of the relatively strong currencies and holding up because of strong central banks in both Brazil and Mexico, those markets are even slightly larger in their share of growth next year and the year after in terms of consumption in dollars. 65% of regional growth will come from those two markets alone. So don't take your eye off the ball. All right, let's move forward. Before we dive into a little bit of analysis, did want to launch the fourth and final poll. And thank you for your patience with that. And then I'm going to explore some of our big markets. And then we'll get into some of your questions that you very patiently put up on the board, and there should be time to address those. So here we're asking you, some of the, we're always looking for some guidance on where should we be focusing our thought leadership efforts, what topics are the people, our clients and people who follow us are interested in. So that's the purpose of this poll here. So appreciate your responding to that. Hopefully you see the entire poll. I think there's 10 options there. Okay, thank you for that. Appreciate that. And that will help guide us in terms of what we write about this coming year. So thank you so much for that input. All right, let me just drill down on a few of the countries that are absolutely essential to anyone's portfolio operating in Latin America. Let me begin by comparing Brazil and Mexico, which again, together are 2/3 of our region. First of all, in Brazil, from an investor perspective, and no political preferences here, but Bolsonaro, as little respect as he engendered, particularly outside of Brazil, he had a first-class finance minister and the support of some very pro-investment legislators whose efforts combined to create some very, very useful and historic reforms in Brazil that have helped, first of all, bring a lot more capital back into Brazil that Brazilians kept offshore, but also that really paved the way to opening up certain sectors, whether it was things like green energy, infrastructure, airports, et cetera, that will have a modernizing impact on Brazil's economy. And that also, there were several changes made to make life easier for investors. There's still a long way to go to reform the Brazilian economy to make it as investor friendly as, say, a country like Peru or Chile, but certainly progress was made over the last 4 years. And at least the reforms that were legislated, as opposed to the ones that were executed by the president, will probably be unchanged, because Lula, although he'd like to change them, does not necessarily have enough congressional support to do that. Brazil's institutions, two of the most important being the central bank and the judiciary, have remained impervious to the assuaging efforts of populist leaders, whether it was Bolsonaro or Lula, frankly. And that's really important and fundamental to the investor's point of view. It's not cheap to defend your investor rights in Brazil through the courts, but it is possible. Now, Brazil does have high government debt levels, and that makes the higher interest rate policies that have been taken on by the central bank very difficult to swallow, frankly, for the government, and certainly curtails any efforts of Lula to expand government or to make changes that he would like, which some people are breathing a sigh of relief about. But it also squashes some of the investment, particularly longer-term investment plans based upon domestic investment money. So that's why we're seeing such slow growth this year. But generally speaking, Brazil remains a great place to invest. Complicated, but positive. From an exporter point of view, this is going to be a slow year. And certainly high interest rates make it difficult for consumers to purchase large ticket items that the different vehicles of finance and lending in Brazil allow. And that's really a result of this hawkish central bank. And with a strong real, which has created a strong real, but a strong real does allow suppliers from abroad to compete in the Brazilian market, where that's been difficult in recent years. Now, there is the risk in certain areas that Lula, through executive mandate, may reverse some of the rules that made it easier for exporters to penetrate the market. One rule, which is just ludicrous, is that Brazil is reinstigating travel visa for foreigners under the philosophy of reciprocity. Bolsonaro had undone that outdated rule, which really comes out of a overly prideful point of view of the Brazilians. And so there will be fewer people visiting Brazil, and there'll be fewer business people visiting Brazil. And that's a pity. But and there's other things around cross-border e-commerce that he may instigate to try to slow that down to protect Brazilian business. So those are some of the things you need to keep an eye on. In Mexico, AMLO has been, we called it years ago, death by 1,000 cuts. It's a gradual undermining of institutions and other counterweights that have allowed him to very impressively in short time build a national party that is likely to win the next presidential election, even though he will be out of power himself. But it has really hurt investor confidence. And now, for foreign investors, such as energy companies from the United States and Canada, that were counting on the USMCA to protect their interest, and generally the USMCA, otherwise known as NAFTA 2.0, has been an excellent vehicle for defending investor and exporter rights into the Mexican market. Very, very interesting summit where the leaders of Canada, Mexico, and the United States met in Mexico City recently. And much of the energy sector from the United States was really hoping that Biden would press the Mexicans because the AMLO and his government have broken several USMCA covenants by curtailing investments, either natural gas related or even green energy related, that are a threat to the competitiveness of the CFE, which is the state electricity company, as well as Pemex. But AMLO waived the immigration card. He and he alone can help stem the flow of non-Mexicans coming into Mexico who then go north and cross illegally into the United States. And they've been doing so from all parts of the world in big numbers, much to the embarrassment of the Biden administration and to the delight of Republican politicians in the United States. And to bolster his likelihood of reelection, Biden basically ignored the wishes of the energy and other sectors that want change in Mexico, or at least want Mexico to uphold the rules of the USMCA, so that he could get an agreement from AMLO to slow down this illegal immigration. So that just goes to show you the level of political interference that AMLO has been able to engineer in Mexico. From an exporter point of view, Mexico's central bank, which remains a hero to many, has been one of the strongest and most important independent institutions holding back the influence and meddling by the AMLO administration. And that has kept the peso strong, surprisingly strong. Now that hurts domestic investment and some consumption, but it certainly helps continued import of consumer goods by Mexican consumers. The nearshoring bonanza that has been in the news, it will lose some of its luster next year, or this year rather, because of slowing demand in the United States and because of the lack of electricity infrastructure that is reaching new assemblers in northern Mexico, again, because of the political meddling in the energy sector by AMLO. Okay, let's move forward. We got a few minutes left. Let me just quickly compare Colombia and Chile, which are second tier but very important markets for many of you in the call. We're very concerned about Colombia. in the sense that unlike Brazil, Colombia has very low government and foreign debt levels. So the central bank is not the same kind of moderating force on government. The government has money to work with. Petro is a highly intelligent politician and very savvy, and is often the case with the smartest person in the room, doesn't necessarily listen to the counsel of others, and is quite dogmatic. And he's put together a very ambitious, almost revolutionary set of reforms that he'd like to push through. He won't get them all through because the Congress is mixed and the Constitutional Court in Colombia is very right-wing. But what he's doing is along with his sort of anti-business establishment rhetoric, politically savvy, but has really drawn a line against the business establishment of Colombia, which is completely unaccustomed to any kind of left-wing government. And so we've seen massive capital flight out of Colombia. Some analysts think that will now reverse. We're not so sure. Most of the investment that's going on in Colombia is short-term perspective to take advantage of high energy prices or the odd investment opportunity. It is not a long-term bet on the country. And from an exporter point of view, the peso did not do well last year. And although it may stabilize more this year, is probably not going to rebound. Again, oil prices are probably coming down a little bit. The big coal export boom that happened as a result of German energy producers having to turn back on their coal plants will probably subside a bit as Germany and other European countries go back to ignoring coal. And although there are opportunities in Colombia, it is not looking as positive as it was just 2 years ago. In Chile, Chile has also been a country of great concern to investors. The combination of a very new political face in President Boric, as well as a constitutional plebiscite that promised some pretty radical changes to Chile's constitution, which many consider the bedrock of its pro-investment and pro-growth history. That really frightened investors. And so when the voters rejected those changes to the Constitution in dramatic fashion, that was a real cold shower to Boric and to others who wanted those changes. Boric immediately reshuffled his cabinet and is now re-engaging with the public, and now through the legislation, a more traditional approach to changing the Constitution with much more moderate objectives in mind. There's no question that in many ways Chile's constitution should be reformed, but I think this second time round will be much more reasonable approach to that. Although Boric sounded like, sort of radical leftist when he was on the campaign trail, he's turned out to be a very studied and reasonable, if naive and ambitious, form of leftist. He has spoken ill of some of Latin America's more notorious autocrats, and we certainly don't believe he is an autocrat himself. He is also, although he would like to bring the state as a bigger player into some of the sectors where the state plays as a player in many other countries around the world, including the United States, such as university education and utilities, et cetera. He is not talking about dismantling the institutions, the independent institutions that are important counterbalances to executive power, like we've seen in Mexico. We also know that the electric vehicle revolution is going to keep copper prices high for some time, and that is going to provide a useful base for Chile's economy. Now, from an exporter's point of view, things are less rosy in the short term. thanks to slow growth this year. A lot of investors are uneasy about this second crack at reforming the Constitution, even if it looks far less radical of an approach. It still leaves things uncertain, which means that consumers are uncertain. There's also been a pretty bad drought that's hurt agricultural output, and that, of course, is an important source of export income. But we do see that Chile will be one of the countries benefiting from a rebounding China later this year. So with that, I'm going to dive in. We've reached the hour, and certainly no one is obliged to stay online, but I'll do my best if there are any questions to answer those, if those of you who want to stay further. So Yash Desai asked, how is food inflation an opportunity? Well, it may not be an opportunity to you as a consumer, but to the economies of places like Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, big food exporters, it means more dollar income coming into those countries, which strengthens the purchasing power of everybody, makes it easier for governments to manage or service their debt, especially in light of higher interest rates. So food inflation is a good thing for food exporters, a bad thing for food importers, and generally a tough thing for us as consumers. So I'm looking at it from a national economic point of view, not necessarily from a household point. Nick Brown asks, how will interruptions in fertilizer exports from Russia affect agriculture in LATAM? Well, certainly, that's a great point, and that's a very interesting thing to discuss. I was in PDAC, which is a mining conference, just a week and a half ago, speaking about this with others, and it is a big factor. Fertilizer prices have gone up. Russia is a very important producer of urea, which is a natural gas based form of fertilizer or fertilizer input. And we're seeing generally that this is part of what's driving higher costs of food prices. So to the degree to which fertilizer prices and input raises the costs as opposed to demand supply issues raising the cost is definitely a negative to Latin America. But I still suggest that food exporters are better off with higher food prices than they are with low ones. What are your thoughts on the return dialogue between Mercosur and EU regarding the free trade agreement? Obviously a welcome development, but this is now over 20 years, or very close to 20 years, these discussions have been going on. And the impediments to reaching an agreement lie on both sides of the Atlantic. Certainly there are protectionists in Brazil, especially, which has a diversified economy, including a large manufacturing economy, that would like to see that don't want to see this go forward. But there are plenty of protectionists in Europe as well, especially from farming economies like France and others, where farmers have a disproportionate political influence, and they're worried about cheap food products arriving to Europe. So I'm not holding my breath on that. COVID showed the danger of a single supplier, especially if it's China. Adding in the recent disruptions in the supply chain showing the need for closer suppliers, how big are the opportunities for LATAM manufacturers moving forward? So there is a movement, and again, part of it is reliance on single suppliers, but I think it's more driven by higher costs in China. And there is a movement to diversify supplier base. So we're seeing certain products going, particularly clothing products that have a longer supply chain time route. We're seeing them going to places like Bangladesh, Pakistan, Vietnam. We're seeing some of the electronics going to Vietnam. Why? Because at the end of the day, the assemblers can't be too far from many of the import producers. So if the components are coming from Taiwan and Japan, Korea, even Thailand, then assembly can't be too far away. But other products and other areas are migrating to Mexico as well as parts of Central America. So again, it'll depend on the product, but certainly auto parts, we're seeing a lot of movement there. We're seeing some movement in high rotation clothing, things like socks and underwear, t-shirts that are bought without much of a fashion cycle in them, but are purchased very frequently, and supply chains need to be closer. So it depends on the product for sure. Juan Gallardo, an old friend, asked a very difficult question. When Xi Jinping visits Russia today, do you foresee a truce coming soon with Ukraine? Will that benefit LATAM? Again, at that PDAC conference, I had the immense honor of sharing a panel with a gentleman who has been a Canadian who moved to the Ukraine 30 years ago and has been instrumental at building that country's democratic institutions, served as Deputy Minister of Justice. His wife is a Supreme Court Justice in the Ukraine. And it is very clear at this point that Ukraine will not surrender its territory that was lost. Certainly none of it that was taken in the last year by Russia. And there's even pretty strong resolve to also keep fighting until they get back Crimea. That latter part may be up for grabs in the sense that a negotiated settlement with the Russians could include the Russians keeping Crimea. But certainly any territory gained by the Russians in the since their invasion 13 months ago will not be given up. So I do not see any kind of negotiated settlement, in spite of what role China might play, because now the West and certainly the Ukrainians are very determined to return Ukraine to its 2020 borders. What would be the role of China? I'm not sure, Massimo, exactly what you mean in there. Perhaps you're referring to the previous question. China has put forward a proposal, but is basically being ignored by the West in terms of a negotiated peace agreement with Russia. Okay, what do you think about Latin America complicated logistics channel and custom official rules for growing e-commerce business? Diego Rodriguez, who runs our logistics practice, is going to be addressing this and many other issues in his version of The Good, Bad, and Ugly later this week. So I would defer to him. But certainly in studies that we've done, there's no question that cross-border e-commerce or e-commerce in general is stymied by two levels. One is last mile, although there's been lots of innovation around last mile. But one of the biggest issues is the cross-border, and it has to do with the either underfunding and inefficiency and bureaucracy of customs, and in some countries, downright corruption that has been an obstacle to cross-border e-commerce. And I know that Diego will elaborate more on that. Okay, Tony Sanford, thank you very much for sharing your news. Okay, just a nice comment. What's the prospect of free trade agreement between China and Mercosur? I would not be able to tell you that. I have no idea. It's a great question. Mercosur as a bloc has not been very effective. And the Chinese are certainly interested. I think you're going to see a lot more engagement by the Chinese now. They were very quiet during COVID. But I think we're going to see a resumption of the kind of international engagement by the Chinese that we got used to. But I'm not sure exactly how they'll deal with that trade agreement opportunity. Do you see political crisis in Brazil with Lula? Although he won the election, does not have people and politicians support, he has Supreme Court support for his political ideas through Supreme Court decisions, creating a very unstable situation. I think as I think is implicit in Alberto's question, and certainly anyone who's lived in Brazil or has been studying Brazil will know that it's a very divisive society right now when it comes to politics. There's a lot of dislike of many of its most iconic political leaders, i.e. Bolsonaro and Lula. I don't think that there's quite the political crisis that is painted in that question. I do believe in the institutionality of Brazil. I do believe that in the rule of law around political elections and the ability to govern. I think that Lula's is coming out as this time as president far more of a populist and with a real chip on his shoulder, because he was sent to jail by, in his mind, by a group of leaders and the supportive leaders that he views as the establishment that he now would like to punish. But his ability to do radical things is limited to his executive powers, which in Brazil are not that strong compared to the powers of the Senate and Congress in general. So I do believe that we're going to have a lost year in Brazil, in the sense that Lula will continue to try to fight these people. You've seen him trying to shout down and change the direction of the central bank. But he can't, he might be angry with everybody, but it's going to take about a year for him to realize that those efforts are useless, and that his traditional way of governing, which is much more consensus building, is far more effective and makes him far more effective. But I suggest that 2023 is going to be a lost year in Brazil because of that chip on the shoulder he has. But when he sees that he's not getting progress economically, when he sees that the currency is threatened by his actions, the central bank has to keep ratcheting up rates because of capital flight, then he is going to, at some point, swallow his ego and begin to govern the way he used to govern. But I do think it's going to take about a year. Tesla's impact on Mexico. The Tesla factory will be very close to the US border. It will create jobs. It is a stamp of approval, but I think it's more symbolic than anything else. I think that most of Tesla's suppliers are still outside of Mexico, so it's purely an assembly operation. That may change over time, and certainly Mexico would like to develop a supplier base of components that go into electric vehicles, but as of yet, has not developed that. So certainly that would be interesting. But the way that assembly operations like Tesla's for export work is there's very little friction in terms of bringing products in from other destinations. So there's not a huge incentive. Certainly under USMCA, there's some incentive, but it's going to take time for the positive trickle downs on the supplier base in Mexico. But in the meantime, I think it was an important win for Mexico in terms of demonstrating to the world that that it can attract, very high-profile assemblers. In which areas do you see more investment potential in Latin America? Very big question. Again, I wouldn't focus on countries. I would focus on industries, and we've done other work. We've written other work around where we see different industries attracting investment over the next 5 years, and welcome you to look at those. If you look at our 10-year demographic outlook or 10-year long-term outlook, the concluding slide contrasts the expectations of different industries, and that's where I would look for that, because looking at countries is really a limited way of looking at the investment environment. With exchange rates perhaps going up this week and the collapse of banks in North America and Switzerland, do you think we will have this echo? So exchange rates going up, I'm not sure what he means, whether he means a stronger dollar or a stronger euro or stronger emerging market currencies. What is very interesting is that these bank rescue, so again, little 101 here, the central banks do not actually dictate interest rate levels. What they do is they set a target, and then they work with their balance sheet supply of money, and they either grow it or shrink it. If they shrink it, rates should go up. If they grow it, rates should go down. And they've been shrinking it, which has brought rates up. And And just in the last week, the $150 billion or so that was accessed, sort of emergency funds to rescue different banks, has the effect of, increasing the balance sheet of money by the central bank, which takes us back around 5 months in terms of progress of bringing down inflation and raising interest rates. So in many ways, that bank rescue, although it will take time for that money to seep into the general economy, has had the impact of lowering interest rates, even though officially the Fed is going to announce an increase, probably an increase, either no increase or a 25-point increase this week. So it's a little sketchy as to see, but I see that these bank rescues are essentially a loosening mechanism, not a tightening mechanism. So India and Latin America. India, of course, has had a growing role in Latin America. Both, India is a very important supplier of generic pharmaceuticals. It's also an important supplier of services, of BPO and other digital delivered services. It's an important supplier of some manufactured goods. It has been a little late in getting to the market with its manufactured goods, but you've seen some service companies like Tata investing in certain countries like Uruguay and Argentina, where there's good human capital at a relatively cheap price. And we're seeing Indian generics popping up all over the region and going toe-to-toe with local suppliers. We've worked on a few of those assignments, and that's an interesting development. India is a private sector driven economy. So unlike China, there isn't a sort of a state apparatus behind those strategies. And Indian companies generally are focused on markets closer to home, but there is a growing interest for sure. So I've yet to see really good analysis tying any contagion to the collapse of SVB and Signature Bank in the United States, or for that matter, Credit Suisse being taken over by UBS in Switzerland, and in terms of contagion in Latin America. But thus far, there doesn't seem to be strong evidence of that. There's certainly not been any call for run on banks in Latin America. And I think that Latin American banks generally are far less levered than US or European banks. So as of yet, I haven't seen evidence of contagion in terms from one banking system to the other banking system. So back to Yash Desai, what I mean is, wouldn't food disinflation be better opportunity for investors, given we investors primarily enter LATAM via sovereigns and currencies? Yeah, again, if food inflation results in a positive terms of trade increase to trade numbers. In other words, if what they sell their export of food is greater than, say, the higher input costs of fertilizers and others, and that brings in more net income to a country like a Brazil or an Argentina or Uruguay or Paraguay, then food inflation is a positive. If the terms of trade weaken, it certainly is the case with net importers, and may even be the case in some countries that are slight net exporters because of higher fertilizer prices, then that's going to hurt those sovereigns, going to hurt the currency. So hopefully that answers your question. Well, I think we've exhausted those questions, and those of you who still remain on the line, I appreciate your patience and thank everybody for joining today. And again, want to point out that this will be this is being recorded, it will be edited, and it will be distributed to you all. So thank you, and I encourage you to listen in to our sector-specific analyses this week. At the same time, you should have received some sort of email providing that, but if not, you can certainly sign up on our website. So thank you again, everyone.